Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid and welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to be diving into a super interesting new instrument made by Landscape and Mystic Circuits called Noon. So in brief, Noon is a passive analog drum synthesizer, but it doesn't function like most typical synthesizers. There is a lot that's really unique in terms of how Noon sounds and how it functions, so definitely a lot to talk about in order to fully unpack it. Now, I just want to say that I am still very much learning about this instrument, and I'm positive that there is a lot more that I have yet to discover. That said, I wanted to make this video because even with what I know so far, I'm finding it to be a really fascinating instrument, and I'm super excited by all of the sounds and interactions that it has to offer. So I wanted to share my explorations and takeaways as they stand so far. As I was prepping this video, I definitely got a little bit carried away at times because Noon is such a fun instrument, so this is a pretty long video. If you're short on time, you can use the timestamps below to jump between different sections. Otherwise, you are more than welcome to join me for the whole thing. Okay, so let's jump in. So when you're first getting set up with Noon, you're going to notice pretty quickly that there is nowhere to plug in a power cable, or in other words, it's a passive device. The reason why there's no power input on Noon is because, unlike most electronic instruments and synthesizers, the circuits in Noon don't all need to be powered in the same way, and they don't require power from a constant level voltage source. If you think about what a typical AC to DC power brick is, it takes the alternating current from the wall and at its output produces a constant output voltage and ground reference. So this one, for example, takes in AC mains on this side and spits out 9-volt power on this side. Most electronic instruments need one of these or something similar to this so that their circuits receive constant clean power. Now, the constant voltage coming out of this power brick isn't that different from control voltage inside of a modular synthesizer. The main difference is that the voltage from the power supply unit is constant, and control voltages can vary. So connecting these two ideas together can make you wonder, what would happen if you used a continuously variable voltage in order to power an entire instrument? Well, the truth for a lot of things is that you would actually probably break them. As I mentioned earlier, most instruments are designed in such a way that they really do require a steady, constant power voltage in order to operate. However, this is not universally true. If you experiment with guitar pedals, for instance, you may realize that it's fairly common for guitar pedal power supplies to have one or two outputs with a voltage starvation control, which essentially allows you to vary the output level for that power connector. This is very commonly used with things like fuzz or distortion pedals and can significantly destabilize their sound, making them go from typical distortion effects to something that's much more abrasive and buzzy and fizzy sounding. Of course, you don't want to try this with just any pedal, as it can still damage some more sensitive circuit designs. But in some cases, voltage starvation can lead to some really interesting sounds. It's actually very common now for voltage starvation parameters to be built right into fuzz pedals themselves to give you front panel control over this exact thing. But in my experience, I haven't seen this type of control on a synthesizer, and I haven't seen anyone really get deep into exploring this technique outside of the world of effects pedals and DIY electronics, with the exception, of course, of Noon, because this idea is pretty key to how Noon works. So as I mentioned earlier, Noon doesn't have a connector to plug in an external power supply. Instead of a single power source, each of Noon's channels are intended to be momentarily powered by an external gate or control voltage source. By running a gate, for instance, into one of the channel inputs, you can conceptualize what you're doing by turning the channel on when the gate is high, and then turning it back off when the gate goes low again. By sending in a control voltage, you're basically continuously changing the voltage at which that circuit is powered, and its behavior can change quite significantly as a result. I wanted to quickly share a passage from the Noon manual because I feel like it captures the creative potential behind this design in a really nice way. By using this unique method, we can increase instability and magnify organic aspects of traditional analog electronic instruments. The sound of analog at its core is the sound of sculpted electricity. By removing the stabilizing elements of a constant power source, we can listen to the sound of electronic circuits loading and unloading, powering up and powering down, and we can increase the natural chaotic movement of electricity. So I personally find this approach to instrument design to be super fascinating. The idea of listening to all of the inherent flaws and instabilities in an electronic circuit is really, really interesting. And I personally love that Noon is designed in such a way that it really encourages people to listen to and interact with chaos and unpredictability. Okay, so now that we've talked about how Noon works on a high level, let's jump into the specifics of the instrument and its controls. In a moment, I'm going to share a whole bunch of different demos and patches using Noon. But first, I want to give you a quick tour of this instrument and all of its various sections and controls. So on the right here, there are two outputs. The top outputs the even channels, 2, 4, 6, and 8, and the bottom outputs the odd channels, 1, 3, 5, and 7. When you're only using the top output, all 8 channels will be summed to mono at this output. This slider here is a volume control for the even and odd outputs. There are also individual channel outputs along the top here for each of the 8 channels. Over on the left, we have gate inputs for each channel, as well as CV inputs for the even and odd channels respectively. So as I mentioned, Noon has 8 different channels, which you can see here. Each channel has a different analog circuit that has its own unique sonic characteristics. So as we'll hear in just a moment, they're all going to respond quite differently to incoming gates and control voltage. The 8 channels are called dot, dual, cis, plast, sympath, syrinx, larynx, and bacid. Or maybe this one's called bacid. I am not entirely sure how to pronounce it, but regardless, these channel names give you a little bit of a hint to the tone, color, and behavior of each channel. The Noon manual goes into depth about each of the channels and their unique characteristics. So if you're curious, you can check that out for a little bit more detail. But honestly, I've been having a really great time just exploring things a little bit more intuitively and letting the instrument surprise me. So for each channel, you have a few controls that alter its behavior, pitch, and textural characteristics. This long slider here on each channel is what's called the pitch 1 slider. And the bottom short slider is referred to as the pitch 2 slider. Now, despite these sliders being named pitch 1 and pitch 2, they may impact any number of different parameters of the sound, such as its pitch, its decay, texture, timbre, or even how it responds to incoming control voltage, depending on which channel is active, as well as what else you have going on in the synth at the same time. So as we'll see in a minute, there are a lot of different ways to create crosstalk and connections between all of these various channels. So personally, I prefer to think of these main sliders more like primary and secondary change controls rather than pitch controls because they can impact so much about the sound. This top short slider on all of the channels is a volume control. Cool, so moving on, we have these red and yellow buttons here on each channel. These are mutes. So by toggling this button, you can mute an individual channel, which removes its sound from its individual output and from the main mix. You can still visualize incoming gates in either state. And at the bottom of each channel, we have a mod button, which changes how the channel responds to incoming voltages and how it interacts with neighboring channels. This is essentially like an alternate flavor or character for each channel, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so let's start off by listening to each one of these channels one at a time so we can get a feel for how they sound. And I'm going to come back to the rest of these buttons and controls in just a minute. We can also run external signals into the even and odd CV inputs to see how that sounds. So in order to do this, up top you'll see these buttons here, which are CV mute buttons. Toggling these on or off is going to determine whether CV from the even or odd CV inputs is passed through to each channel. Awesome. Now that we've listened to each channel, let's return to these remaining controls that we have here on the panel. So in between each channel, there is a link button, which allows for the sharing of voltage across channels. This is similar to a kind of cross modulation in which input to one channel can affect another and vice versa, resulting in all kinds of really interesting and unpredictable shifts in timbre and response. And because these CV inputs here go to all the even and all the odd channels simultaneously, you can create even more crosstalk and instability between the channels by unmuting various CV to numerous channels at once, even if you're not sending a gate signal directly into those channels. So for a quick example of this, I'm going to send a gate into channel 1 and a sequence into the odd CV input, and we'll see how that sounds. And finally, these gold designs here on the panel are actually touch plates that you can use to apply even more modulation to the sound. Now, in certain settings, the impact of this can be quite subtle, but it's definitely something that's worth taking some time to experiment with and explore, because you can get some really expressive and beautiful results this way. Now, I'll be honest here, I'm not exactly sure precisely what is happening when you interact with these touch plates. But in my opinion, that added layer of mystery kind of adds to the spirit of the instrument and makes it even more fun to interact with. Awesome. So now we have a pretty good lay of the land with Noon. Now, of course, everything starts to get way more dynamic and even more interesting when we start to combine all of these various controls and elements together. So let's take a look at some demos of all of this in action in a more complete way. So in this patch, I'm using the dynamic envelope output along with a few different gate outputs on the zero control to trigger different stages on Noon. And I'm also sending the top row from the zero control into the even CV input and the second row on the O control into the odd CV input. So aside from its ability to send out a lot of different gate and control voltage signals all at once, I'm finding that the zero control is a really interesting companion for Noon because you can start and stop the sequence. You can very easily vary its speed. You can interrupt the sequence by playing the touch plates and so on. So here's a simple example that combines a Eurorack modular synthesizer with Noon. So I'm using the Make Noise Woggle Bug, which is a random voltage generator, and I'm sending a stepped random voltage out to trigger channel 2 on Noon, and a smoothed random voltage into the odd CV input on Noon. Awesome. So Eurorack synths have a whole host of modulation and control voltage options available, which makes them particularly good at helping us build out generative structures and more complex interactions. So let's take a look at how we can build this patch out a little bit further. So one thing that I discovered, which is pretty interesting, is if you send constant voltages into some of the channels on Noon, you can get the instrument to start to drone. And then by varying those voltages, you can vary the pitch. So here I'm sending the top row from the 0 control into channel 1 on Noon. Now, of course, we could expand this by sending a second row of voltages out from the 0 control into another channel of Noon and tuning them to one another so that we can create some harmonies. So I'm going to expand this patch one more time by sending the third row of voltages here into the even CV input on Noon to see what that does. And now we can toggle these CV mute buttons up here to determine which channels receive this control voltage. This patch is a slight variation on what we were just looking at, but instead of sending the constant voltages from the 0 control into specific channel inputs on Noon, I'm sending the top row into the even CV input and the second row into the odd CV input. And that allows us to create some really, really interesting stacks of tones and harmonies. Now, one thing I'll say is that tuning the various channels to one another is very unpredictable because a lot of these sliders don't respond in a very linear fashion. So you might turn something up and instead of the pitch going up, it might drop or it might cause the sound to splinter and start to kind of sputter and so on. But personally, I find all of these instabilities and this chaotic nature to be really beautiful. All right, so for this demo, I'm starting with the same drone patch that we were just listening to, but I'm taking the outputs from Noon and I'm running them into the Vongen Ultra Shear, which is a stereo vibrato and reverb pedal, and then from there into the Red Panda Raster, which is a pitch shifting delay. You're also able to run an external audio source into Noon for some crazy lo-fi filtering and distortion effects. So for this example, I am taking the audio from the microphone that I'm speaking into, and I'm running it into the audio input here on Noon. So I'll turn up the volume here and we can take a listen to the effect that that has on my voice. Hello. Hello. Now, of course, we can expand this by simultaneously sending in gates and control voltage into the various channels on Noon. All right, awesome. So now let's try running some other things into Noon to see what it sounds like. All right, so the last thing that I was really curious to try was what it would sound like to run my trumpet into the external audio input on Noon. So for this example, I'm running my trumpet into a Eurorack preamp module. I'm using the dope for A119, which I can leave a link to below. And I am taking the audio signal out from there and running that into Noon. And I'm also doing a couple of other things. The A119 has an envelope follower built in, and it also has a gate output with a variable threshold control. So I am also sending gate outs from this module into Noon to trigger a few different channels, and I'm using the envelope follower output as a control voltage source for a couple channels on Noon. So basically every time I make a new sound on the trumpet, it's going to pass the audio through to Noon, and it's also going to generate a gate signal and a continuous control voltage that's all being passed to Noon. All right, so I couldn't resist trying one more thing here, which is to connect MIGSI into noon to see what would happen. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what MIGSI is, it stands for the Minimally Invasive Gesture Sensing Interface for Trumpet. In brief, it's a sensor-based interface that I co-developed with Ryan Gaston a number of years ago. You can see it here attached to my trumpet. Basically, the way that MIGSI works is there's a whole bunch of sensors in different places on the trumpet that can detect things like when I move my valves, when I move my horn, when I put pressure with my left hand on the front or the back of the valve casing, and so on. And that sensor data is sent over to my computer, which is then converting it over into control voltage, sending it out through the Expert Sleeper's ES8. And that is coming into noon. And I'm also sending the audio from the trumpet directly into noon as we were doing before. So if we turn noon up here and I move some of the valves on my trumpet, we should be able to hear noon respond. All right, awesome. So the connection between MIGSI and noon is working. So I'm just going to improvise for a little bit and we will see what happens. All right, so we've taken a look at a whole bunch of different patch ideas and ways of interacting with noon. And I'm sure at this point you're starting to see just how deep of an instrument this really is. I feel personally like I am just barely scratching the surface of what's possible. And I find that really exciting. I'm really looking forward to continuing to explore noon and continuing to get to know it further. As I was preparing for this video, I was reminded of a quote from an interview with David Tudor, who is an experimental electronic music pioneer who made his own, often very unpredictable and chaotic electronic instruments. When talking about his approach to working with instruments and sound, Tudor said, "I try to find out what's there. Not to make it do what I want, but to release what's there. The object should teach you what it wants to hear." In my opinion, Tudor was a master at creatively misusing electronic equipment and devices to make interesting sounds. He would do things like plug outputs back into inputs and connect things together in incorrect ways, all to create really dynamic interactions and to thoroughly explore every corner and every angle of an instrument. This is an approach that I personally find really, really inspiring. If you're interested to learn more about David Tudor, I'll leave a link to an amazing book that was recently published all about his life and work in the description of this video, so you can check it out. To wrap up this video, I want to briefly return to some ideas I shared earlier on about listening to and interacting with the inherent instability and chaos within electronic circuits. Now, I share frequently on this channel about my love for feedback patching and no-input mixing. This is an approach that I am really inspired by because of how much life it gives to your instrument. When you're working with a feedback patch, the relationship changes that you have with the instrument. And instead of it being a one-directional thing in which you are in control of your instrument, it becomes more of a two-directional partnership, or almost like a dialogue. And the instrument is something that can respond to you, but it can also surprise you and lead you in entirely new directions. I feel like Noon really captures this spirit as well. It's the kind of instrument that invites a deeper mode of listening and experimentation rather than suggesting just one correct way of interacting with it, which is a workflow that I personally find super rewarding. If you are interested in learning more about Noon or possibly getting one for yourself, there are some links in the description of this video that you can follow. And if you're interested in joining an amazing community of folks who are passionate about things such as experimental sound and electronic music and modular synthesis, or if you're interested in things like behind the scenes content and unreleased music, then I invite you to check out and possibly join my Patreon community, which is patreon.com/Sarah Belle Reid. Becoming a member of my Patreon community also supports everything that I do as an artist and makes it possible for me to continue making more videos like this one. So thank you. All right, that's it for today. I hope you found this video inspiring and informative. If you want to be notified the next time I release a video, you can subscribe to this channel. And as always, thank you so much for watching and for listening. I'll see you next time. You're gonna have to move. I gotta film. You gotta get off the table. Come on. Scoot. Zoo. Come on. I don't want to push you off the table. Can you get off? Yep. There you go. Thank you.